Hello, distance learners. Today is February 2nd. If you look over here, you can see the Big Four. We're going to be learning about them today. So World War I, the war there, 1914 to 1919, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. So, just as a little background, right now in the world, there is something called the Spanish flu that's going on. It's much similar to what we have actually going on now, which is COVID. So as the war was coming to an end, something new was coming, the Spanish flu, they called it, much like COVID-19 for its time. Soldiers were bringing it home from war. Wilson is said to have taken ill with it while at the Paris Peace Conference. They first thought that he was being poisoned, but it turns out that he was just violently ill with this Spanish flu. So Wilson was in this deadlock trying to explain his 14 points, and while he was in this deadlock with the Big Four, he became ill. So that's a little background to where we're at. So who are the Big Four? David Lloyd George from Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, Georges Clemenceau from France, and Woodrow Wilson from the US. That's the Big Four. That is the Allies. So the Big Four, when the heads of the four major allies, France, Great Britain, Italy, and the US, meet in Paris for peace talks, they're more focused on their self-interest than they were about Wilson's plan. They weren't really too concerned about his 14 points. Each of them wanted their own thing. The big thing was hang the Kaiser. Lloyd George of England insisted that Germany accept responsibility for starting the war. They wanted to include this war guilt clause, so that's what England wanted. The treaty required Germany to pay $33 billion in reparations to the Allies. So that's payments for losses, reparations, payments that are demanded by the defeated nation to the victor to offset the costs of the war. Germany resented both the war guilt clause and the reparations, fearing that the payments would cripple their economic recovery. So they're thinking that if we have to pay you guys all this money, we're not going to be able to rebuild. So just as a recap, at the Paris Peace Conference, just like we were talking about yesterday with the 14 points, the Allies leaders meet without the Central Powers. It's just the Allied powers. France is concerned with its security. France hoped to weaken Germany to the point that they could never threaten France again by greatly reducing its army. And Wilson believed that Germany should be punished, but not as severely. He just wanted a settlement that would not leave Germany feeling resentful. So at this point, Wilson's plan is just crumbling. He's not defending it like he was, and it's just kind of falling apart. So Wilson compromises. The other countries had lost so much. They'd lost lives, property, and they expected compensation. The U.S. came into the war a lot later, so they weren't feeling it as much, but he recognizes that the Allies had borrowed huge sums from American banks to finance the war, and they'd hoped to repay these debts with the reparations from Germany. Wilson reluctantly agreed to the harsh treatment of Germany. So the League of Nations, which was one of Wilson's 14 points, he still hoped to include the League of Nations in the final treaty, and that would make for his compromises, that would make up for the other compromises. He believed that by providing collective security and a framework for peaceful talks, the League would fix many problems that the treaty had created. So collective security. Wilson believed that the League would maintain peace by providing collective security for its members. Collective security is a commitment by many countries to join together to deal with a nation that threatens the peace. So it's the World Justice League. And they were able to all come together and agree on the treaty. Yay! Fireworks! But Wilson still had to get it approved by the U.S. government, because we are a democracy. So there's weaknesses of the treaty. Flaws in the treaty sowed seeds for the post-war international problems that eventually ended up leading to World War II, which we'll learn about. It humiliated Germany. The War Guilt Clause forced Germany to admit sole responsibility for starting World War I. There was no way that Germany could end up paying this bill. And Russia was excluded from the peace conference and lost more territory than Germany did. They had the most casualties in the war and fought for 3 years. Only 3 of those years. So, ratifying the Versailles Treaty, Wilson required a 2/3 majority vote from the U.S. Senate to ratify the treaty. There was opposition, though. Reservationists such as Senator Henry Cabot Lodge were concerned with the Article 10 of the League Charter. This article focused on collective security. It required member nations to work together and even supply troops to keep peace. Reservationists feared that this would draw the U.S. into wars without approval from Congress. So President Wilson decided to gain public support by going out and speaking on a tour. The President embarked on an 8,000-mile speaking tour of the West. He spoke up to 4 days a time. September 25th, 1919, the President collapsed in Pueblo, Colorado. His doctors stopped the tour, and Wilson's train sped back to Washington, D.C. Soldiers were returning. Manufacturing for the war was done, and they're no longer feeling all the Allied forces. So there's issues closer to home that occupied most of the Americans' concerns, including inflation and unemployment. So partisanship ends up defeating the treaty. Wilson became ill, and he suffered a stroke. The U.S. Senate rejected the League of Nations and signed a separate treaty with Germany in 1921. Wilson's hopes for the U.S. membership in the League of Nations was left out. So, the legacy of the war. Many Americans look forward to the return to normalcy. World War I had made many changes in the U.S. It strengthened the military, social changes for African Americans and women, called World War I the war to end all wars. The Treaty of Versailles settled nothing, and Adolf Hitler emerged as an angry World War I vet and rose to power in Germany. All right, so if you look on the left here, this is Germany, or this is Europe before 1919. It's just Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then you have Russia over here. But if you look over here after 1919, Germany is still up here, but parts of it has been gone to Poland. We have here, so it's not just all Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. So there's a lot more smaller countries than there are over here. Mandate system, so Great Britain and France divided up the Middle East. Britain takes Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, and France takes Syria and Lebanon. The War Guilt Clause. The Allied and associated governments affirm that Germany accepts the responsibilities of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associate governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of a war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. That's Article 231. And so it's basically just saying that Germany accepts responsibility for starting the war. Reparations. Germany agreed to pay for the damages caused by her armies during the war. The sum ended up being $6,600 million or euros. So how did Germany react to the treaty? Germans thought that the treaty was diktat, a dictated peace. Basically, they didn't like it. They felt like they had to sign it. War was threatened against them if they did not. It was not based on Wilson's 14 points. In Germany, a large part of the reason why they stopped fighting was because they believed that they received copies of Wilson's 14 points, and they believed that's what the whole peace was going to be formed around. and it was not formed around that. Most Germans believed that the war guilt clause was unjustified, and they had done that. The French and British had done just as much to start the war. The loss of territory and population angered most Germans who believed that the losses were too severe, and many Germans believed that German economy would be crippled by having to pay reparations. The Treaty of Versailles recap: Germany, forced to accept full responsibility, loses all its territory, must pay reparations, payments to the Allies, and must only have a very limited military. So if you have any questions, please reach out. I have my email. You should have that in the welcome letter, and you can always reach out to Mrs. Zimmerman as well.